Do you think we should maybe do some kind of introduction here and just say, like, hello, internet, I am the Muscle Dad?
Yeah.
Do we want to
I
use names? How do we want to handle that?
I guess. Yeah. I mean, oh no. I mean, I don't know that FooBarWiggle is a great.
I mean, are you known? Is that a handle you use across the internet? I'm basically, at this point in my internet career, I am Muscle Dad everywhere. So, like, that's a
Muscle
that's a
Dad.
solid handle I'm sticking to. But
Okay. Okay. I mean, there's definitely people who use their. I mean, my name is Connor. I think we
yeah, I
all
mean,
have that.
yeah,
I can be FooBarWiggle though. Like that can be my.
I don't. I seriously like. I'm okay saying my name is Roy. I have no problem with
Sure.
that. I've said my name live on stream on Twitch multiple times,
There
so
you
that's
go.
not an issue for me. I'm known as the Muscle Dad wherever fine
Okay.
digital products are purveyed.
Mm, yeah, I probably should pick a pick a name that doesn't suck. But in the meantime, I mean, yeah, I'll figure out a. I've also been flirting with that YouTube channel idea for a minute, and this is a way to kind of just like break the ice on the whole thing. Like,
Totally.
just do something.
Yeah.
So, uh,
Yeah, man.
that's
I think I've got like
kind of who we are.
I've got a net like 60 views or something across all
All right,
videos. So that feels nice. That's
all
okay.
right,
They're all
nice,
VOD. They're all just like VODs that I uploaded from when I was streaming regularly. But,
nice.
you know,
Yeah.
I mean, not to
Well,
brag or anything, right? Like, I've got tens more views than you. So, I'm kind of slumming here, giving you my time, but we can work it out. We're old friends, so I'll do you this favor.
I am a just a, but a peasant among royalty here. So thank you for deigning
Yeah, no
to
problem, my
entertain
guy.
my nonsense. What do you what have you been streaming? What do you want to be streaming? What's good?
That's a great question, actually. That's a good place to start. So
Yeah.
it's actually, I'm just going to say, it is super cathartic just to be in here with my rig all set up. I spent all this time, like, investing in a mic and investing in a camera and, like, learning how to use OBS, which admittedly, does not take a ton of time, but, like,
That is
I,
some.
yeah, because I was streaming once a week for, like, a few months, and then, my laptop had a water related incident, and that kind of put the kibosh on that. And then I got the laptop I have now, and I've streamed a few times since, but I just haven't gotten into the rhythm. And actually, it's one of those things that I think would be really good to do because sometimes you just wake up in a day and you're like, I could just fuck off, but I want to feel like my life is moving forwards somewhat, and somehow like sitting in front of a camera, probably just because you've been like brainwashed by all of the content creators that you idolize to think like, oh yeah, I'm doing something tangible by playing a game that I would normally be playing, but with like the pretext that it might get advertising money on some level.
Think there is more validity to that I mean to stroke our own stupid ego here, but I think
Sure.
there's a lot more validity to that. It is. I don't know, people talk a lot about like the internet as a space to like have connections and like make community,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know, I feel like I encounter that idea a lot. And I encounter it from people who are like, oh yeah, like old school internet and like cool forums, and it's like I was a teenager at the times when people are talking about those things,
Yeah.
and I mean I remember, in my sense of it, like Reddit already being just a bad place to be.
It was from
Like
day
it was
one.
never good in the
No.
past. It was
Well,
a
because
lot of assholes.
it was always just you got to call it like it is, and that is that Reddit is 4chan's little brother, right? Or younger sibling. Sorry, I don't mean to be sexist. But it has
I don't
that
mind.
real, like, it's it's the same thing, but it just because people knew that 4chan was a thing already, that meant that there was an audience for it, and people wanted to like get that feeling, and Reddit delivers that. But if you've ever actually been on 4chan, you know that it is like, it's a shadow of, like, Reddit is a shadow of what 4chan is, right? Like 4chan like overthrows governments and things. Like, you know what I mean? For better or worse.
I think that, 4chan is just, well, I bring all this up to sort of say that
Yeah.
we sort of, it's always kind of been rough, but in a way, like, and I guess the spaces that have specifically spoken to me are spaces that are a little bit more sort of produced, even if it's just enough production of like your face and voice are like present. There's a modicum of ownership behind the words instead of just absolute shit posting.
Yeah, like I think one of the big ones. I mean, of course, that's a big part of it, is like the deliberate anonymity of places like 4chan, where like people are trying not to be connected with what they create. But also, there's just something about like, you know, I know a lot of people who aren't like big content creators or YouTube personalities who like have something you would describe as a logo. I mean, I guess Instagram contributes to this, right? As a lot of people don't have like their face as their Instagram picture. They have some kind of iconography that they feel represents them. And there's something about that, is about when you can tie together like a username and a like creative style and like a specific set of icons. Like somehow that adds an air of authenticity that people connect to.
I mean, like the idea of a brand is, I guess, when I was in like college for business and had to do the marketing class stuff, it was difficult to, I guess, take marketing seriously, like for me,
right?
Because it is so much just like it's so cynical in like, hey, these things that have value and meaning, how do we leverage that for commercial gain?
Yeah.
But it is like that's the sort of bizarre upside down world of like meaning and purpose are a means to an end, instead of like meaning and value being the intrinsic end that you're actually looking for. So it's, but I mean, as an angle of even approaching the whole idea, like you take it for granted that like words mean things and symbols mean
yeah, right. Yeah.
And then when you like actually sort of like think about, oh, I guess like participating in creating that. So going back to, you know, and presenting yourself on the internet, where you are so sort of like nothing, or you have to have some way of identifying yourself,
right?
Because of how the whole sort of space is structured. Like you need the recognizable name, you need the recognizable symbols to sort of like let people sort of like quickly construct meaning and kind of like get a picture of the context around what is otherwise, you know, just bytes in an endless stream of just disorganized nonsense.
Yeah.
And so here we are.
Well, here we are. Yeah.
I think.
Well, so I mean, that's one thing I'll say, right? Is like, as someone who has made a, you know, a fairly meager attempt at streaming. I mean, first of all, I'll say it's amazing how quickly it happens that you actually start to attract people, because like that's one of the things about streaming is like, of course, everyone starts like they have a favorite streamer or content creator and they're like, I'm gonna be that guy, and obviously that doesn't happen overnight. But what is surprising is like you just need to be streaming anything and you'll have like people pass through and just like say random stuff. Like I remember having my friend Plash, who I won't say his name here because he hasn't given me express permission to use it, but we used to stream together on a regular basis, and like a lot of the times that we would get the most engagement was not when people were like, when we were talking about like what we're trying to do in the game and what our goals are and like the details. Like it would be just like saying dumb shit about like, oh man, watermelon candy ain't shit, you know? Fuck, watermelon candy can, you know, whatever, you know, and its mother can, you know, that kind of stuff. Like, you're just like, just letting loose and having some nice banter. Because, to be fair, and this isn't meant as like a mean thing, I think people. One of the things that's weird about the internet is that it has replaced the social interaction that people used to get from like public spaces. Like, it is a public space, right? But it's not a physical public space. And as like population centers expand, it's like harder and weirder to just be like, I'm gonna go to the plaza and like hang, you know, when you populate, you know, you live in a town of 6,000 people or whatever, and like, I'm not talking about like some small town now, but like, you know, you go back 200 or 300 years, and like, you know, tens of thousands of people is like a major population center, and you have a different sort of feeling where like everyone is utilizing these public spaces. Maybe that's where like farm stalls or like basic tradespeople who aren't part of a bigger company, like there's all these people who are naturally aggregating to this space, and so it just makes a certain amount of sense to go there. But it's like people don't just like start conversations with strangers at coffee shops unless they do, and I just don't know that. But like, it's sort of analogous to that. I don't know.
I mean, I think sociology and kind of like general human sort of culture is, it's frustrating because it seems so dumb, and it seems like every individual in that process is not thinking very hard and not behaving in a particularly complicated way, but taken in aggregate, like sociology is really difficult to get a handle on. And be like, why are things the way they are, especially in this abstract kind of social. And it's like, was it always this way? It's hard to even say, because it is such, like, the water you swim in, of, like, how do you, like, talk? Like, who do you talk to and when and why?
Yes.
And,
yeah, right?
It's not like people were, you know, I guess you have like, sort of media and stories that present an idea of what someone thought it was like at either some point in the past or could be some way in the future. And it is, it's hard. It's hard to know what's normal, I guess. Like,
yeah, that's real. And it's like people are so, you know, I think and a lot of it too is that obviously we are in the midst of a, like, I hesitate to use words like revolution because they are very loaded words, but like, you know, we're in the midst of a massive shift in the way the average person goes about finding work and making money. And a lot of it comes down to the fact that, like, less people now than ever are doing, I don't want to say unskilled jobs, but specifically working as, like, itinerant laborers. Like, that's a thing that's really important. Like, when you understand the history of, like, work structure, like wealth structures in Europe throughout most of the, like, the Middle Ages and Renaissance, one of the big things is that, like, people, like, you think about a farmer as, like, farmers are, like, the lowest level of society, right? Like, they're doing, like, the bottom back-breaking work. But actually, like, a farmer is a person who owns an amount of property. And that in itself, like, they might rent that property from a landlord, but at the very least, they are someone who's statused enough that they actually can, like, afford to own the space that food is grown. And so they will hire seasonal labor forces, people who, like, come, you know, they help them reap the wheat during the, like, 1 month out of the year where that is a relevant job. And then the people who do that have to, like, find other consistent sources of work. And so one of the things is like, that's how you get, you know, like, a lot of people meet, you know, a lot of people meet through work. That's how a lot of people find their social circle, or at the very least, like, through school or other kinds of mediums that just, like, draw people together, like, regardless of their interests. And now, more and more than ever, people are, like, self-selecting the field they go into based on personal interest, up to and including people who, like, make a career out of just talking about their hobbies with people they like. And so now it's like people are self-selecting into what community they feel like they belong in, and a lot of that is relative to what your interests are rather than like what work you have to do or what skills you've developed as a means to live.
This is an interesting kind of angle on labor organizing almost, which I mean I think it sort of I think there is something to like pre-industrial labor organization where I think in a lot of ways like really what you're organized by is almost not your access, like it's not work, it's like your access to just fucking food and shelter.
Yes.
Like or seasonal labor, it's like, well actually in the off season you just sort of try not to starve.
Yep.
Like, you do whatever, but it's like, where are you gonna go in, your 14th century France? Like,
yeah.
You gotta stay on the farm you're on. You're gonna get the vermin away from your grain stores.
Yeah.
That's basically what you do all winter.
Yeah.
And make candles. But post-industrial, there is this sort of like organization around labor, and then like work is a thing that draws people together. And now with really, the internet and I mean, there's probably very different and interesting things happening in places like China or other places where like labor-intensive industries are kind of thriving. And not to say that farming and agriculture isn't both labor-intensive and a part of the American economy, but it's not one that you or I are all that in touch with. But yeah, this like labor organization and like the decline of labor unions as both a designed sort of policy thing, but the structure of the internet has in a lot of ways made that a lot harder, or whatever it's going to look like is going to have to be very different.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I mean, I think it's interesting. It's like I feel like how do people meet now? It's like Discord servers, right? Like you go to the Discord server of the content creator you're most interested in. I mean, so for one thing, like recently I've been spending a lot of time on Magic the Gathering, and there's a shout out to the Command Zone YouTube channel. That's a good channel, they do good work. But one thing that I find very interesting about them is that it was just two friends who happened to work in Hollywood together, and they just also liked Magic the Gathering, and so then they just started a podcast. And that was just like a thing to fill space while they just did their real work. But now, like, they've been doing this for, I don't know how long, 7, 8, something like that. 7, 8 years, something like that. And they have reached a point now where, like, they have, like, 20 employees. And, like, it's grown into this thing where now there's, like, high production value and a lot of editing is done and so, like, they're interesting because they're kind of a cottage industry that has naturally developed around, like, their force of personality and interest. And, like, they are industry insiders in the film industry, so they have certain connections and an understanding of certain, like, aspects of what goes into making a successful production company. But, like, it is interesting that, like, that is an example of a thing where these are just about, like, all the people who work for them, the only thing that really unifies everybody who works there is that they all like Magic the Gathering, right? And, like, people have moved from other parts of the country to work in LA for their company. And it's just this weird thing where it's, like, a lot... And, like, and then they have a big Patreon Discord community. And so it's, like, if you like... you're a lonely person and you don't have a lot of friends who are interested in what you're interested in, but you watch a lot of this YouTube channel, they are a gateway into a social entity that is their fan base, which is weird. Like, it's not just like, oh, well, this is all of the men of a certain age who work in a certain industry, and then like you kind of find your best fit friends within that conglomerate. Like it's just it's a weird thing where it's like you've got like, because now people like the proximity that draws people together is no longer physical. It's no longer like where you live and who you've met, and you've only ever been 100 miles away from your town, and it's like you only have like there's a limited percentage of the human population you could have ever interacted with. And now it's like that percentage is gigantic. You could meet so many people. Like it's absurd. And so it's like now that you can basically be friends with anyone, how do you actually do that, and how do you actually like meet those people? And I don't know, it's weird because it's like a lot of it is this like self-selected communities that you find out about because of your interest, but that's also like very narrow, because then you only end up going to the things you already know you're gonna like and meeting the people who like already match a specific set of criteria that you feel comfortable opting into.
It is this like, and I mean you're describing something that is actually pretty relevant to what I was probably at one point trying to say until I got both of us very off track.
I don't think there's a track, but yeah.
Yeah, no such thing as a track. Maybe we can call it off the tracks. We'll put a pin in that for
put out possible names. Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah. The idea that finding community online is even possible, and I'm like, what the hell does that look like? And then I kind of throw up my hands, and I'm like, I don't know, is it worth it? Would it even be worth it if I could figure it out? When it's like, I mean, there are ways to go out into the world, like I've got my stuff to get involved and meet people in the real human meet space.
Mm-hmm.
So like, and I kind of opt into the sort of traditionalist mindset of like, oh, well, that's how I really want to do it, and all these nerds on the internet don't have to matter. But like, at least certainly in a professional standpoint, I do all my work making web tools, and I learned all of those skills from the internet, and it's that, at least from a professional space, is like really connected with me and really got me excited about giving back to that in some way and sharing what I've learned and contributing to open source, and like that's all compelling to me. But yeah, when it comes to just like even more from a social standpoint, the fact that you opt into things that you're already pretty comfortable with, and the sort of in a way being kind of forced into novelty by the world is more rare. And I noticed that on YouTube, I guess, where I get a lot of content there, and then I'm like, how am I out of things to watch? Like, all my go-to stuff, I'm scrolling through the feed, and it's all stuff I either have watched, like, basically stuff that I already have watched, or a bunch of stuff that I'm like, I guess I have this filter of, I think I know what it is, and I'm pretty sure I won't like it.
Right.
And that's, I guess, where it is that I'm like, I had kind of a cool experience with this, just with, new channel, and I guess it was so clear, like, going from, this wasn't on my radar, wasn't something I was gonna click on, to, holy shit, this is cool, I'm gonna, like, watch all of these, but what it is this guy who, so he's does a bunch of like software design, but is also a classical composer. And I think that was the part that most of his videos like are either exactly in that overlap. Most of his big videos that are getting popular are exactly that overlap of like software that has been built specifically to write sheet music for classical scores.
Right.
And I think I saw the classical music stuff and was just like, I don't really think this is going to be for me.
Yeah.
But I mean, on the one hand, there is a whole side of it that is like very connected to like what I do, and I'm like, oh, this is like cool to talk, like hear someone smart talk about UI design.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, the classical music stuff. I'm certainly have more respect for it than I did before.
Mm-hmm.
Though there was like something where he was showing how like there's a process of like turning the score into music,
Mm-hmm.
and he spent like 20 minutes describing all the intricacies of a new system that he sort of helped build.
Mm-hmm.
That was like way better at translating the score into a played back piece of music.
Mm-hmm.
And then he showed the side-by-side examples of like what it was before and what it was after, and I could not tell the difference.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he was so passionate about it, and I'm like, it sounds like music to me.
Yeah. That's funny.
But new stuff. Just shows how much I have to learn, I guess.
Well, it's funny what you say though, where like that's always one of those things where you sort of like you set up these artificial thresholds for yourself, and you're like, I'm gonna like this and I'm not gonna like that. And to be fair, a lot of that is a byproduct. Like, one of the things that I have with that is where it's like all of my content is in one direction, and all of a sudden I'm like, actually, I would like something radically other. And like there are literally like teams of computer scientists paid very good money to make sure that I get what I already know I want. And like there's not a mechanism, like, unless higher ups at Google prove me wrong, but like unless there's some subdivision of that team who's like, well, actually, we're gonna throw in with a 10% variance just like some shit we think you might like. And like, the only way that they could ever kind of triangulate something like that is, this is popular with random people who have nothing in common with you, maybe you'll like it. And like, yeah. I guess that's how, like, that's how things happen kind of organically in the world. But it is interesting where like you paint yourself into a corner where you say like, I do like this and I'm not really interested in that, and then you just get like inundated with a whole bunch of content that like confirms that bias. And then it's really just up to you to make some kind of elected decision to just like change up that metric. And it's really just comes down to like, you don't always know what you're gonna like until you try it out. But also, like, you're just it's just this weird thing where it's like 75% compatibility on this video with things that you already watch is enough so that like this is a thing you don't really care about, but it's tangential to something you do care about. I guess like we're just gonna like fire hose that at you. I don't know. It is a weird thing where like, how do you, because you don't just bump into stuff in the way that you do in the world, and you don't just have like a friend come to you and be like, hey, listen to this music. It's just like, this is what is like that's an example, right? Like, how would you find new music that isn't like something you already listen to and isn't generally very popular? Like, what metrics do you use?
I was gonna bring up music, or just another sort of experience I had with that recently. But when you were like, how do you just find new shit? Like, I remember, going back to Reddit, there's r/new.
That's true.
And, I don't know that, people sort of had this complex of like, oh, like if you're on that, you're deciding the fate of a lot of these posts, because you kind of kick off the algorithm one way or another. I don't know if that's true, but an experience I had with music recently. So I went to go see my sister in Eugene. She's a lot more hip. Like, Eugene in particular seems to have a really thriving, like, kind of punky house show scene,
Mm-hmm.
or just
Oh,
like
that's
that's
cool.
what all college kids do. Is like some kind of BS degree, and then just play play bass at their friend's house,
Mm-hmm.
and get really stoned. So, and I was sort of getting to know some people in that scene in Santa Cruz before 2020, which I would have loved to stick around for more of that. But anyway, one of them was talking to me about a band that has recently. I guess they're in Portland now, but they started in Eugene, and they're like, "You gotta listen to this band," and I did, and they have one hit song that's just kind of a good, sort of like jazz situation, um, but I listened to more of their discography, and it is like decidedly electro swing,
Mm-hmm.
and I was like, I would have I think if I don't know if I had heard any more of it, totally out of the blue, I probably would have written it off,
Mm-hmm.
just because there's a lot of bad electro swing out there.
Yes.
um, but knowing something about both the artist and kind of like having this like human connection and like
Yeah, that endorsement from someone you have any kind of connection to.
yeah, and then also listening to it and like I know some things about like or at least I consume a fair amount of like jazz and like
Mm-hmm.
swing and big band because that's all in the realm for the Lindy Hop that I do,
Mm-hmm.
and it got me thinking about like, oh, why do people hate on electro swing so much? And it's like because the bad stuff is like just a producer taking samples of like a jazzy horn or saxophone
Mm-hmm.
solo and then like looping it in a way that becomes so inane very
Mm-hmm.
quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but when you can actually that this was like recorded for like this is an artist playing the instrument for a song that was actually written for that purpose. You're like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, like putting kind of a trancy bass line underneath that is like not inherently a crime.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you ever see that? Remember they remade The Great Gatsby? Like I don't even know. It probably was like 10 years ago now or something. I'm old.
Yeah, the Leonardo DiCaprio.
Yeah. That.
Yeah,
Did you ever see that movie?
I didn't watch it.
We watched
I
it
didn't.
in like I want to say I watched it in like an English class or something, which was really weird. Like we read that book and then
Mm,
I don't know, maybe I saw it around that time in parallel, but that movie featured a lot of electro swing and it felt very like I really disliked that because it felt like it was this sort of parody of a period piece where it's like that as a choice, like whoever's behind the scenes creating this film is like making a choice that's like metatextually couched in the fact that modern people who like electronic music are gonna be like watching this film, and it's like but it's like like it's sort of parody because it's not just like it's like trying to add some kind of faux authenticity by putting swing music in a swing era film, but then it's like also pandering to like the modern sensibilities of like the music tastes of the people who are going to be watching it. So it's this sort of surreal mashup that like is only a very specific product of the moment in time that movie was made, but sort of divorces itself from like the source material and any kind of connection to it. It's just
you
weird.
know, yeah. The thing is that suits exactly my perception of that movie as being like not quite a period piece, but not a totally a modern reinvention of the story, which
Mm-hmm.
in a way would have like that's, I mean, like Wolf of Wall Street was like a great instant classic
Mm-hmm.
for the reason that it said what it said, and it didn't really pull any punches.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to, it sounds like this Great Gatsby thing, kind of like trying to have its cake and eat it too. Of like, we're just a Great Gatsby movie,
Yeah.
and we're gonna do these things that make it look and feel very modern without. I mean, I want to like. I think the most generous take is that it's an experiment in like finding kind of an aesthetic middle ground.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like very 2010s, like
Yeah.
all the live action Disney remakes, which
Mm-hmm.
generally are just cynical cash grabs.
Right.
But it's like, to the extent that there is this classic story and there is this like new technology that you can kind of like try to make something beautiful out of, like a lot, like not all of it's gonna hit, and some of it's gonna look like a weird, terrifying abomination. And the question is, and so it's like, I guess I'm like writing it all off. It's like, well, it was a good try.
You know, I mean, there's something to that. You know, it's like you gotta have.
Maybe.
Huh? Say that again.
Oh, I just said I hope maybe.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's one of those things about like trying to create and just like make art in general, is that it is like you need space for failure, right? Like that's just part of the process. I guess the thing is though that's really funny about it is that it felt like it's sort of like like you make the point of Wolf of Wall Street. I will say I have never seen Wolf of Wall Street, but I know a lot of people really like that movie. But I think one of the things that's compelling about that is that it is its own creative expression, and it's like based on it's designed as a critique of a specific moment in American history, but it's bringing whatever modern sensibility the creative people behind it have about that moment in time. The thing that was weird to me about The Great Gatsby is, first of all, that book is like a cautionary tale about the extravagant lifestyle that the wealthy people lived during the Roaring Twenties, and how it like every important character in that book fucking dies, right? Like it's not
hardcore tragedy.
Yes, right? But the thing is that this by trying to like put in like contemporary to the time of the film's creation, like exciting like exciting dance music that's compelling to like it makes it into this sort of like party spectacle. Ooh, isn't it so fun to drink champagne and like listen to jazz? And it's like, unless you're going to actually use that as some kind of vehicle to like make a critique of the way that this parallels the destructive nature of the modern party scene, now you're just sort of glorifying all of the elements that the original story were trying to parody. And it's like, you missed the point, and then you use that missed point as the foundation for your new design, instead of like actually trying to understand what the source material is attempting to convey. So it just feels like you know, there's also a scene, I forget who it is, I want to say Tobey Maguire is in that movie, and there's like a scene, I think it's him or whoever plays the main character. It's like,
yeah.
and there is a like a huh
That's great casting if it is him.
yeah. But just there's a scene where he's with like a bunch of flappers, right? And I think with Leonardo DiCaprio, and they literally like he like, you know, they've all been drinking champagne and having their fun time, and then all of a sudden one of them pulls out like a little white pill and like puts it on Tobey Maguire's tongue, and he's all like, oh, you know, what's gonna happen? And they're like, don't worry, just let yourself go. And it's like, and then he's, you know, he starts having his trip, and then they're like, you know, they're like recklessly driving down the highway. And it's like, the thing is though, is like all of that imagery, that is more of like, that is derived from like the drug culture of like the 60s and the 70s. So now you're sort of like you know, you're mixing up all of the like classic images of a party lifestyle across a span of time indiscriminately in a way that seems purely intended to convey how cool parties are, right? And it's like, it starts to have, eventually, if your perspective is broad enough, eventually you have no perspective at all.
Or I think it's this, so, and also, welcome to our podcast. We talk about 10-year-old movies.
Oh,
one
yeah.
of us has watched.
Yeah, we go off the tracks or whatever.
Yeah.
I want to talk about some of your background art too, but we can get to that later.
It's kind of not. Oh, there's actually this one. Hey!
You've got the Great Wave. That's a nice one. That's a. Oh, there you are. Okay. We'll edit around that. We'll cut that.
Okay, yeah, sorry. I was like, oh no. Wait, I should have taken that time to get online. But now that I can.
We'll edit this. We'll get this all.
This is a trick that I heard from the McElroys. Is you
Oh yeah.
do something in the waveform or here. So.
Yeah, so you can sync up the visuals and the audio.
Well, no, that one's. This is actually for if you're looking for like. I know there was something that we had to cut.
Oh yeah.
You can like see in the waveform like, oh, there's like something that happens here,
Mm-hmm.
and then going back through it. I think, or actually, what they said is they have a little clicker and they do it 3 times so you can see it.
That's an obvious thing. That's good to know.
Yeah.
A little bit of how the sausage is made. Yeah. Those are the perks of being on, listening to this podcast, is you listen to what other podcasts have said about how to make podcasts.
Yeah, we talked about other podcasts and old movies.
Yep. But not like classic movies, like irrelevant movies from a decade ago.
That were like not good when they came out.
No, things that flopped.
I'm trying to. It would be interesting to sort of play archaeologist on how we got there, because it feels like abstractly relevant to our sort of laments about society and culture, and being like, yeah, a Great Gatsby movie, that was a hell of a thing.
That's how I feel about the whole 2010s, man. I know I was there, but it just feels like it was a weird blur.
I think maybe, and I mean, this would be a fun think piece YouTube video to talk about how that movie is such the you could read that movie as like an allegory for the whole decade.
Mm-hmm.
Of like starts with the early part of the Obama era and ends with Trump and America so much. It ends with Trump and the depths of the pandemic, and it's like, damn. But
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess technically, it's like not pandemic, but it's like everything right up to it like that end of 2019 feels so kind of like poignant in retrospect.
Because we got dumped into the pandemic right after it.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I think of, and this is related to the idea of electronic party music from that era, is I remember, I started high school in like 2010 or something like that, and right around that time, dubstep as a genre of music was beginning to like really expand into the public consciousness. And obviously that didn't last very long. That its period of relevance was pretty short-lived, but by the end of the 2010s, you were hearing like trap music in commercials that were put out by like major corporations. And now like trap is the new basic structure of hip-hop music. That's what the bass lines for hip-hop is now, right? Like,
my understanding of it, don't. I feel like I don't know enough to know, but it sounds right to me.
It's just funny. Like, it was funny to watch because that was one of the things I say about, like, when I was in high school, a lot of the people I was surrounded by were party kids. And I dabbled in that life too. I had a bit of experience with that. And so what was funny about that movie was that it just had, we're still talking about The Great Gatsby for whatever reason.
Yeah,
But
we got, yeah, we're staying.
what was funny about it is that I felt myself being pandered to as I was seeing it, because it just had this air of, like, what do kids like? Well, they like drugs and electronic beats, and this is a movie where substances are taken and parties are had, so maybe we should sort of, like, mash up these aesthetically sort of approximal
Yeah.
things into a larger packaged product. And it just felt so, again, it just felt very cynical, like going back to, like, the cynicism of taking meaning and turning it into product. It just felt like, it's not like I'm saying, oh man, they didn't get it because the dubstep scene was so pure at the time. That's, that was not true. But it is this thing where it's like, it felt like someone has heard about something and understands that it is monetizable, and someone else is like, for whatever reason, people are reading The Great Gatsby these days, and it's just like, it was just this really haphazard mashup of two things that it didn't feel like anyone had a specific vision of, like, oh well, this dubstep artist had always paid homage to The Great Gatsby, and he'd sampled all these things from the previous iterations of the film, and he had this real love of, like, 1920s music. It just was like like, old people are starting to listen to electro swing. Everybody wants to feel young. This is a property that's probably not that expensive to get your hands on. And it was just the perfect storm for a thoroughly mediocre filmic experience.
Yeah, that, or thorough, like, because my understanding is it was a pretty movie and, star-studded cast, but yeah, thoroughly mediocre kind of attempt at making meaning.
Yeah.
that having a story, and I think because there's a lot of stories, there's a lot of, like, movies that don't mean anything or don't really even try to. They're just kind of like, it's just dumb fun and it's whatever. But I think it's just like, and it is also just, it's cashing in on The Great Gatsby being a, like, piece of literature that is required reading.
Yes. Yes.
Which I think there's an interesting, like, angle on that of so cashing in on intellectual property, that felt like, so there's, I want to, one thought that I just think is delightful. Again, sort of like, when you, in retrospect, you didn't even think about it that much when it was happening, but, like, LMFAO,
yes,
they, like, released their first thing, like, smash hit in 2010.
Right.
It was their party rock anthem.
Yes.
And then their next album was Sorry for Party Rocking. And then they were never heard from again.
Oh my goodness. That is pretty funny. But right, I mean, that kind of speaks to, again, that was like a thing in that era, was like vapid electronic music was starting to permeate the zeitgeist, and it was becoming pop music, right? Because, again, it's like, it's interesting to think about, like, what was the pop music of the 2000s. Now we're doing it all, right? We're breaking down the last 20 years. And it's funny because it's like, you start out the 2000s with, like, it's like the tail end of, like, the R&B, like the R&B of the 90s, and then by the end of the decade you've shifted into this surreal auto-tune hip-hop is pop thing, and those are kind of related, but, like, I mean, even now, again, like the 90s, early 90s, grunge, late 90s, overproduced R&B. And, like, that's, like, a weird shift where, like,
Yeah.
what once was someone's cultural music, R&B, is now this, like, weird, overblown product with, like, now, like, Usher and, like, all these people who became huge names and then discovered people that don't even get talked about anymore. Like, Justin Bieber, right? He got discovered by Usher. He's not relevant anymore. That's not a relevant thing. I don't know. It's just like this like this cycle of taking the rise and fall of intellectual property and the way that a feeling gets turned into a product and then it dies on stage, right? And like the thing that's so interesting about, say, like electronic music as an example, and like a party music, because that is just relevant to my period of time. Like, I was a young teenager at that moment. And the thing about that is that it's like you think about what it feels like when you're with a group of people that you love to talk to and you're all sort of intoxicated, and like everything you do and say feels important and meaningful. And obviously, like, the next morning that it isn't. Like, as soon as you wake up, you have this like weird sense of loss for like, oh man, everything made sense when I was out of my head last night. And then you take that and you expand it out to try to be like, how do we capture that feeling for a lot of people? And the thing that's funny about, say, like, as opposed to like, bands making music, is that all you need is like one person with a bachelor's degree in like making music on a computer to just throw money. You just throw money at them and describe a general sense, like an atmosphere and an aesthetic, and they can make you a multi-million-dollar product that will be valid for a couple of years. And then its shelf life will just use itself up, and no one will think about it ever again.
So this sort of the process of cashing in on intellectual property is and yeah, kind of to your point, cashing in on a feeling. I feel like where I observed that specific experience was in games that I got really invested in, and I mean, I think really the Bethesda story is the one that's most sort of poignant. But I felt like I have a mixed relationship to a similar thing basically with the Civilization series. And for me, I guess I kind of think it's like there's only so many games that you can pour hundreds of hours of your life into, and those were a couple. Actually, yeah. So I'm trying to think about I'm trying to have like a catalog so that it feels I can talk about a trend in the industry rather than 2 or 3 examples of things that happened.
Yeah.
But I mean, in a way, like the specific examples are going to be more interesting narratives. So the Bethesda story of like both Elder Scrolls and Fallout are amazing worlds, like that both had a lot of history and had a lot of kind of creative energy put into it. And then just watching it instead of nurturing the parts that made it great, it's kind of squeezing out the juices of like what are the good parts.
Yeah.
And when you make a game and it's even halfway decent, like you could argue that it's adding to the world and it's expanding canon, but you start to see how that's not true always. Or the Hobbit movies as
yes, those I think are a fantastic example. But sorry, go on.
Yeah. This example of the difference between a generative art that generates an engaged caring, enriched audience, and then art that doesn't and makes things that actively cashes in on that. And like cashing in means like taking money out. It's like it's weird how directly it maps to like the your brand's equity is like you would think of that as this intangible that either can't go away or it doesn't behave like an asset, and that's like kind of a bad analogy, but it's like weirdly good when you're like, no, you have this thing, you can directly trade it in for money, and you distinctly have less like respect, less like enrichment, well, less engagement from the audience. Like it is a trade-off that is being made. It's not a win-win thing. Like it's the value and the meaning that people have behind symbols and stories is actually not it's not permanent, and it's actually something that needs to be like taken care of and nurtured. It can't just be taken for granted.
Yeah, I think it's those are a funny example. I really like that you bring it to that of all things, because games are always cannibalizing each other for like innovative ideas, and especially like Civ is funny because like you take Civ, like there was a huge fall off, and like there's a big schism in the Civilization community between Civ 5 and Civ 6, right? And a lot of that was because like Civ 5, I didn't play Civ 4 or the previous games, and I imagine Civ 4 was even more complex than Civ 5, but in general, at least Civ 5 tried to like maintain that sense of like this is a grand game with a lot of interactions and a lot of permutations that you can engage with. And Civ 6 really, it was like, now, okay, Civilization now has a certain level of like name recognition among people who don't play it. So what we should try to do is try to adjust our form factor instead of to cultivate the brand structure that has built this franchise. We're going to pivot and try to specifically alter that in order to bring in new people. And so what they did, right, they tried to make it more intuitive, and like instead of having all the models try to be as like, all the Civ leaders used to try to be as photorealistic as was, relatively speaking, right? Try to take, it had a realistic style, it tried to be serious, and then Civ 6, now you see, everyone is a cartoon in that sort of like easy to produce, low poly, recognizable style that all like major multiplayer games use because it's like easy on bandwidth. And like it's interesting that that was a huge loss for them in terms of like their credibility to not only their fans but as like a pillar of the strategy game industry. And it's interesting because like the reason I think that The Hobbit is so interesting, partially one is that Peter Jackson built this thing out of nothing. Oh, I'm bumping my microphone. But he built this thing out of nothing and then immediately like burnt it to the ground for everything that it was worth just to make a quick buck. And it's so interesting to see like one person do that instead of like some weird group of like production executives come along and just like gut everything he had. But there's this great clip from the making of The Hobbit of Ian McKellen, and he's like sitting at a table, and the table is green, and there's like green backdrops, and the chair he's sitting in is green, and there's these two like camera arms, like two little like adjustable arms with like a pillow with like a paper cutout of like the characters that are supposed to be in the scene with his face so that he can look naturalistically at the right place. And there's this moment where he's like trying to do the scene, and he literally just like has like a tiny little breakdown where he just like is like covering his eyes, and like he has like a little sob, just a tiny little sob, just to himself. And I love it because it's like he was on the original movies, and he went, like, he had the experience as an actor of, like, going into a purpose-built set that felt like a lived-in home for a hobbit, right? Like, and yes, they had to do, you know, forced perspective and stuff to get him and Elijah Wood to make sense talking to each other, but at the very least, like, there was a lot of, you know, he's sitting on a wooden chair that someone at a production company had put together. Like, one of the things that was so praised about the original trilogy was the amount of practical effects that went into it. All of the costumes, all of the armor, all of these things were, like, actually built. And that was, like, part of the grandeur of those movies was, like, this is basically all real. We went to New Zealand and we actually, like, constructed all of these things. And so then when you come to The Hobbit, it is all of those things, but in name only. It tries to capture the aesthetic qualities of that, but all of the work, all of the internal development that went into that film that made it so successful and such a, like, an indelible piece of cinema, all of that was completely bereft in, like, the new productions. And they opted for, like, oh, well, this orc looks all fancy because that'll be great when we do it as a video game and he's a boss, right? Like, he needs to have a distinctive look that means that, oh, you can tell right away that this guy has, like, 10 times as much hit points as everybody else. But it's like, I don't know, I find that to be a very funny parallel, because you have one creative person who had a very strong creative vision and then completely, like, acquiesced on it when called upon later to profit off of that same thing that he had built.
So I can't speak too much to it, but you know, so Lindsay Ellis is a creator who makes some good stuff, and she did a long form couple of videos on The Hobbit, really outlining the point that we're making in a lot of good detail, and at least in that she outlines the narrative as they had brought in Guillermo del Toro to be the director on the first one, and kind of or at least the idea was that potentially he would do all of them, but basically, yeah, the executives were sort of, like, seeing how it was turning out and realizing that it was not going to look like the originals. That Guillermo del Toro had a very different sort of idea. He wanted to make it a little bit more sort of, like, I mean, true to the book, like, sort of fantasy whimsical. Like, not high fantasy, but almost, like, low fantasy.
Yeah.
Focus on the dwarves and stuff. And they basically kicked him out and then dragged Peter Jackson back in.
Yeah.
Who, from my understanding, didn't want to do it, but for whatever reason was there. And that's my. But yeah, I think that there's not a ton of, like, I don't think that he was super public about his opinion on. He did him, so there's some responsibility there, and but cashing in, being like, oh yeah, people really can't look at the Lord of the Rings the same way after those movies. Like,
nope.
It's kind of bad.
Yeah, and like
same thing with I was like, oh, another one where they did that I guess I didn't really have the same level of investment in. Is the, like, shitty Harry Potter spinoffs they're making?
Oh yeah. Well, to be fair, did you see some of the later movies? Because that franchise was already going downhill. But it is fair to say, I did rewatch all of those movies, not a super long time ago, like less than a year ago. And those first, like, 3 or 4 are, like, that, especially those first 2 are, like, really solid, like, fit, like, you know, they're definitely for kids, but they are, like, they don't talk down to children. Like, they're legitimately terrified. Like, if you are a child, I remember being a child watching those, and they were terrifying. The scene I like that was a palpable feeling I remember having watching those movies. Was I remember how afraid I was in certain specific moments while watching them, and one of the big ones was whenever you have like the main kids and they're like isolated with a danger, a very present danger is like right in front of them, and there is a palpable sense that like there's no one around, they're completely cut off, like these kids are gonna get like jacked up, and it's like, you know, you as an adult know like, oh, this is a movie, they're not gonna kill their kids that they're trying to like make a franchise out of, but like the fact that they were willing to like put something in a movie that would make a child feel that way is like not condescending in a way that I feel like all movies are now. Like I feel like all of the Marvel movies are so bereft of any of that, any kind of genuine sense of stake or like palpable experience. They're just so obvious, like regurgitations of Saturday morning cartoons with a massive budget, which were always intended as like advertisements for a specific toy product put out by a particular company.
I'd love to, I mean, talk about good movies, and
Someday.
someday. They fucking made one. I mean, yeah, there's been good stuff. Like, Everything Everywhere All at Once was pretty cool.
People said that was good. I never saw it, but I heard good things about it. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess I stopped following the whole Marvel thing after I think like Age of Ultron, where I was sort of like, this is getting a little overdone for me. So I'm like, I don't know, movies. But cashing in on what was once really nice. And now it's like, fuck, we're sort of living in this like wasteland. Like, oh, here's this thing, except it's, you know, the newest. Anything in the last 10 years has been kind of really shitty out of that, you know, fantasy space. I don't know. What's been good? I mean, here's a house. People, space where good new content is coming from. Well, okay, two ideas. One is kind of the democratized sort of just the internet, as anyone can make their own, you know, little sort of piece of the pie, and constructing content and meaning and stories is, in a way, like, I think part of the reason it's a little bit hard to think of good, you know, big budget movies is because, like, the smart creative people are just doing shit on their own.
Yeah.
Like, it's all independent creators. And but the other one that I was going to talk about is Coffee Stain is great space where they've. But I just thought of because I was like, man, Satisfactory is a lot of fun. Like,
yeah,
that's something I've found myself drawn to and enriched by, and really excited about how the 1.0 release goes.
Oh, it's not. Is it still in early access?
It is still. Yep, they're on their updates, and they have a story in the works that will be their 1.0.
Okay.
Which I think is going to be really. I can only assume it's going to be very good. I hope.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, right? Because it is. I mean, shout out to Coffee Stain, and like that's one of the things too. Is like a lot of the best content that's come out in the past like 5 or 6 years has just all been video games. Like Hades was amazing. Supergiant has always made really good content. And there's a lot of just like there are still lots of amazing people making interesting creative products, but I guess like one of the things I think that's interesting is like, you know, like in the era, like, you know, we're a little too young to fully appreciate this, but VHS was like a world-changing technology at the time, and in particular, you know, not world-changing, but it was like it it in a way that we talk now about like the democratization of putting out content and not relying on like major studio systems to like just create things. VHS had a similar quality where like one of the things I think about a lot is, I don't know if you've ever seen the original Evil Dead movies.
I haven't seen them because I wouldn't really go out of my way to watch horror.
I have to say though, this is the thing. I don't watch horror movies. Evil Dead 2 is amazing. You have to see it because it is such a... I mean, it is such a strong creative vision, right? Like, Sam Raimi went on to make a lot of other really interesting movies. Obviously, it's funny to say, remember those good Spider-Man movies? Because now we're literally, like, multiple generations within our own lifetime deep on, like, reboots of... Like, even the fact, like, the fucking Andrew Garfield ones, like, those are hilarious to think about because it's, like, those were so nothing, and they've already turned into a new cycle of, like, just regurgitating that stuff. But what I thought was, like... But the thing that's interesting about Evil Dead is that it was just made by, like, a guy and his friends who wanted to make a movie. And they made a full-on movie. They didn't... And, like, this is one thing that I think is really weird about the YouTube space, is there's lots of people making content and lots of people who make like genuinely very good content, but I'm sort of surprised that no one just like gets together with a group of their friends and like makes short films or even feature-length films. Like there used to be like full-on guerrilla movies that people would make. Not just, like, independent, like, small art house companies producing them. Those still exist, and there's good movies coming out from people who do that kind of stuff. But, like, there were people who used to, like, get no... Like, they wouldn't take no for an answer, and they would just make the thing they wanted to make, and they didn't conform their product to fit the expectations of the medium. And I feel like in YouTube as a specific space... There's a lot of people who make a lot of really interesting things, but they've definitely, like, warped the structure of what it is that they make to fit in with, like, the expectations of the projected YouTube audience at large.
YouTube is yet again facing backlash for making some choices around their monetization rules.
Yeah.
And that got me thinking, when people talk about that that's a big part of it, actually.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you sort of see people, especially the more established ones, it's just sort of taken for granted. Like, there's amazing content that's here for me for free from this, like, awesome, well-established person, and then you're like, oh no, they're making a living off of this,
mm-hmm.
and that's why they're able to. And I think there's a lot of I think there's a lot of good there, but it also creates a significant amount of incentive for a specific kind of content,
mm-hmm.
and playing around these rules, having opinions about that, where, you know, college kids or college dropouts or whoever that can make something on a VHS and be like, I'm gonna make this thing because I just really want to. Like, there is no monetary incentive there.
Mm-hmm.
That when you have the internet, and the internet kind of gives you access to
mm-hmm.
potentially real money, or even just any money, it changes how people approach the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
Might be a shame.
I mean, I guess part of it comes down to... I mean, one of the things that's interesting about the internet that we kind of take for granted is, like... And I mean, I guess you could say this about, like, most public works projects, which fundamentally the internet kind of is. It's, like, basically a public utility. But I think of it in terms of, like... What if there was, like, a company and, like taking Google as an example, which has its own specific, like, terms of service and, like, like acceptability guidelines about what it's willing to promote and like monetize. Imagine if like 90% of the roads in the country were all made by one company, and that company made very specific regulations about like what you were allowed to do on those roads, and if you didn't do that, like if you did not stick to those criteria, they could just say you can't use the roads anymore. You're not allowed. That's not an option for you. Go find some other roads. But it's like if you like essentially get blacklisted from like the platforms of the internet, there isn't like a second internet. Like there's like alternative web browsers and things, but fundamentally like the people who own data banks that the internet actually requires as like the infrastructural backbone of digital communication in the modern age, like there are just companies who can just say like, nah, you're done. We're not having you anymore. And it's like, I guess that's kind of what it comes down to, is that like you take like a VHS and like, maybe Blockbuster isn't going to carry your VHS, but if you can convince your local video store, like, I got 5 of these, just put them on a shelf. You don't like, I don't expect anything. You keep all the money. I just want exposure. Like, that's just down to one individual making a yes or no decision about their personal business. And that's like, as much as it sort of feels like that's what a YouTube channel is, it fundamentally isn't. It's like everyone's actually working in a giant, like in a cubicle in the giant like YouTube warehouse. And if you like don't meet the policy, guidelines, they'll just like, nah, man, your space is someone else's space. Doesn't matter if you pay your rent. You're out, and we're just gonna put somebody else here.
Yeah, no, that's man, I got like you made the point really well, kind of, that in, at least, good like a good old-fashioned movie rental, as a way to kind of, as it's something, it's a way to get exposure, it's a way to be out there, and it's genuinely democratized, as opposed to what we call sort of the democratization of the internet. And it's like, yeah, but and not to say that like the organizations are necessary, like they're kind of doing their best,
sure, totally,
sort of, or at least I don't want to go down the like total rabbit hole, but there's like I think that's one of the things that I guess has made me, or at least it's a lot easier to be comfortable with my relationship to big companies and big organizations, when it's like, at the end of the day, like, I'm the consumer here, and so all of this is built for me to get safe, easy to consume content that I have at my leisure, and if I don't want it, I can go play outside, like, as opposed to delving into the sort of creator side, delving into kind of engaging with it in a two-way street, where it's like, well, not only am I like here to get a little bit of information and enrichment, but I'm here to kind of like give and sort of like really put myself out there, and really in that way you're sort of making yourself vulnerable to the power structure that you're participating in.
Yeah, and I mean, like, we as consumers, right, if that company didn't provide, if they didn't make the roads, we would never get access to to that content. Like, that they are, it's not like if that person was like dedicated enough to like start posting VODs to a personal website, like that they would get even a fraction of the amount of exposure. And there's no like internet directory that allows you to like sort out or like find those things.
Other than Google.
Yeah, well, but that's like heavily based on like a variety of engagement metrics, right? And like, you can dig pages and pages down, like, probably the further away you go from the top links that you get from Google, like the more, I'm not gonna say ethical, but like that's where a lot of like the actual independent people are gonna be, but because they like don't pay their dues to like the internet union, they don't get the same kind of promotion. So I don't know. It's like being a genuine independent is like it's a much more nebulous thing now because you're existing in an architected space, right? Like fundamentally, like the world, when you go out and you touch meat space, right? Like that is built in a way for the convenience of human beings, but it's also not like it's like down to its basic, down to its smallest details, it is not architected for the convenience of individual people. Whereas like we have fully been able to design every aspect of the internet ecosystem from the ground up, for better or worse. And so we are more reliant than we have ever been before on the oversight of like infrastructural bodies that provide the basic like means of conveyance of like content and materials.
Yeah. I well, I think something that at least a little bit shakes up the paradigm, and it goes back to just the economic reality of it is Patreon
Mm-hmm.
and kind of direct support, because you have all these very abstract ways of giving someone attention, which has to be, when the money has to go through the hands of an advertiser and then the platform and then the creator, it adds a lot of layers of kind of incentive and mixed communication. But when it's this really direct, like direct feedback,
Mm-hmm.
it's different. And you run into things though where it's like, I don't know, in a way, and I think like for a long time, kind of like GoFundMe also as a like or Kickstarter as
Mm-hmm.
like early platforms built on the basically peer-to-peer money systems. I'm sure there's plenty of abuse and money laundering,
Mm-hmm.
but I think also one of the biggest things that's like basically sob stories,
Mm-hmm.
and the yeah, there's sort of there are I guess I'm acknowledging that even in direct sort of peer-to-peer conversations, like being a slave to like what's popular, what's going to get attention, what's going to sort of get money out of people's wallets, does still have kind of perverse incentives, or at least doesn't necessarily incentivize really good art and content,
Mm-hmm.
because people are dumb.
Yeah, right. And I mean, you can't. There's no accounting for that. But it's just
I
it
guess.
is. Hmm.
I said I guess not.
Yeah, I don't know. All right. Well, we've been talking about the pains of the modern era and content creation for long enough. Do you have anything else fun you want to talk about?
Um, yeah, we have. Um,
I didn't expect this at all. This just happened. I was like prepping
yeah.
topics, but this just has kind of been flowing. So whatever, just roll with it.
I think this is the podcast now.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, this is a test run, right? This is number one.
Yeah.
I say we just, you watch someone on their 300th episode and you're like, man, they're so good at this. And it's like, yeah, like, of course they are. They probably weren't when they started.
Yeah, like there's a couple people who like actively dissuade any looks at their early content.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Do I have any? Did I have anything? No, not really. I mean, I'm just living my life. I mean, all of my nerdy web dev stuff, but Uh, uh, what is good in what have you been playing? What have you been excited about recently, if any?
Ooh. Well, I mean, a lot of it is I'm trying to be more. I haven't played video games in God knows how long, and a lot of that it just comes down to. I mean, I've been playing. I guess I've been playing physical games more, so I'm DMing a campaign right now, which is fun. That's like the first time I've ever I've tried my hand at it before, but this is the first time I've ever really DM'd a campaign, and it's been really fun. It's weird. I think we may have talked about this at some point in the past, but for all of, like the time I've spent like looking through D&D books, the amount of like real D&D I've ever played is actually fairly minimal. And I've only ever been in like a few campaigns of any like I don't want to say merit. That sort of sounds condescending to people who've DM'd for me in the past, but any kind of substance. Like I feel like first of all, if you play Dungeons and Dragons, I think you've definitely had the experience that you like painstakingly go through the process of making a character for a setting that your DM has described to you in great detail, and then that whole experience lasts all of one session, and you like have the one session and you sit down and you play the thing and then you never come back to it. Like scheduling happens, or like the DM just isn't willing to pull everyone together, or they ate up everything that they had prepped in like 1 3-hour session, and now all of a sudden they're like, oh god, that took me like 6 weeks to make. Now I have like, am I gonna need another 6 weeks before the next one comes around? And then if you're waiting that long, it's just never gonna happen. But it's been good. It's been really fun actually to just kind of like, it's a great creative endeavor for anybody who like wants to get involved in a creative project but doesn't necessarily know what they should work on. It's like the value of like homework or going to school is just the fact that it's like it hangs everything that you have to do on some kind of like organized structure, right? And like Dungeons and Dragons does the same thing where you're just all you really have to do is pull together game assets and arrange them, but you also get to add as much character as you want. Like you can enrich and enliven it as much or as little as you kind of desire. So that's been fun. That's been a nice experience. Um, and then yeah, I've been playing a lot of Magic the Gathering recently, and that's also very good, but it's like gratifying in a completely different way, where there's like
Yeah.
there are storytelling elements, but it's mostly just like a strategy game. But part of what's fun about part of what's fun about Magic, I'll say, is that like part of what's compelling about it is that you have excuse me, you have like tens of thousands of cards from across like a 30-year history, many of which are like pretty obscure or niche in their use case. And so then like a lot of the different people get different things out of Magic, but a lot of the enrichment for me personally is I love like Wizards of the Coast has like a really good online database for Magic cards, and so like they have their own officially supported card database that has like advanced searched options, so you can like really nail in like weird specific card effects that you're looking for. And so for me, part of the fun is like digging up weird cards, or like taking cards that are in a set that most people don't even think about, but noticing that they like interact with certain other game pieces in a very compelling way, and create some kind of new gameplay experience that other people aren't like looking at or thinking about.
That's fun. That's that sounds like I mean, yeah, that sounds like the kind of thing that well, my brother would get really into.
Yeah.
um as the gaming the game, like trying to
Mm.
beat the system, because when and yeah, Magic seems like a cool space where there is so much. I mean, I wonder. I guess in a way, like competitive things are they always sort of inherently get balanced out by the players. Like the
Mm-hmm.
players sort of figure out what the meta is, and then the meta is balanced. And then it gets shaken up every new release. But when you explore it, not looking for a way to win, but looking for a way to just push the limits
Mm-hmm.
of this big, kind of really complex Rube Goldberg machine. It was like a lot of fun.
Yeah, it is a lot of fun. I definitely really do love Magic a lot. I think one of the things that's cool is, it's like it's so interesting. I mean, talking again about like the way people consume corporately disseminated content. One of the things that's interesting is that you sort of view it as this like monolithic thing with its own life that exists outside of the creative people who bring it, who like design it. And it's like that's one of the interesting things about Magic is like it's been worked on over such a long time by so many different people with different perspectives about what makes the game exciting that there's lots of like one of the things that is fun is like when a new card comes out and it makes all of these old cards that used to have no relevant use case all of a sudden like they develop all this relevance. And a part of like the joy for me, of course, is like being someone who's like trying to get out onto that frontier where it's like this card, X card has existed for a really long time, but it didn't have, it only did something fairly mundane. But recently, a new thing has come out that allows you to recontextualize what, what the cards can do. For instance, I'm going to get into it if you don't mind. If you'll humor me for a
Sure,
little
let's
bit.
get into it.
I am working on a deck. I have been working on a deck for a while now. Here, I'll show. Ooh. This is my camera is displaying everything in reverse for some reason, but that's fine. Yes, so this is Ashaya Soul of the Wild. And this card is really interesting because, I know you know just a bit about Magic, but you know enough to play the game. And so, to any of our listeners who might not be aware, um, there's two kinds of cards in Magic: lands and spells. And lands produce the currency that you use to play spells, and spells are the cards that have significant effects in the game, right? And so there are lots of aspects of the game that interrelate with those two game pieces, the two fundamental game pieces. And because lands are sort of like the supporting framework for the game, they they experience a sort of a protected status, and they serve this sort of they're like an evergreen aspect of the game. And so this card, the reason I find this card so exciting is I've always been a big fan of trying to get the most out of lands. Most people are perfectly happy to put their lands down, tap them to create mana, and then cast their spells and not think about their lands any more than that. But I always loved lands because they are the fundamental game piece and everything is built on top of them. And there are lots of cards throughout the history of Magic that allow you to do interesting things with lands. But what this card in particular does is it makes it so that all of your creatures in play, which is a kind of card, one of the most common types of game pieces, they are all considered lands. And this opens up a bunch of interesting consequences. And the two main things are, one, now all of a sudden, all of your creatures are able to produce mana, which opens up a bunch of possibilities. Um,
Wow, I didn't expect that.
yeah, there's a lot of weird stuff you can do with that, but there's also a lot of effects that are balanced around like a lot of the effects that relate to lands or relate to creatures are balanced around like those specific game pieces' place in the larger tapestry of Magic the Gathering. And so like lands, very few cards interact with lands, and cards that do interact with lands do it in very particular ways. And so one thing I have found, I derive endless pleasure with this deck in finding all these new weird combinations of cards. And like there have always been these cards that will like take your lands and like turn them into creatures, either temporarily or for the rest of the game. And usually that is like a very dangerous thing to do, because now all of a sudden you're like taking your most fundamental income stream and you're putting it at risk, because creatures engage in combat and they can die when they do so. And so the cards that do that are balanced in a particular way. They often have additional clauses that say things like, when this land, if it's a creature and it dies, it will like return that land to your hand instead of putting it into the graveyard, so that it's like it protected because you're already going out on a limb and giving up certain viable assets in order to try to gain an advantage somewhere else. And so all of these kinds of cards that interact with lands, because of the way lands are regarded in the like the system of Magic as a whole, they are not balanced around interacting with creatures. And all of a sudden, as soon as you can start doing these things that you're supposed to only be able to do to your lands, to your creatures, all kinds of new possibilities open up. And so like these cards that are designed, you know, for instance, that like make a land into a creature, they have all these protection clauses attached to them so that you mitigate your loss if your land dies. But a similar effect designed to go on a creature would be designed in a completely different way, particularly without these protections, because creatures are meant to be sort of like a disposable resource that is traded with opponents. And so now you can start slapping all of these these spells that are designed to defend your lands in all kinds of weird and specific ways. You can start slapping those on your creatures and creating all of these horrifying interactions that people aren't really used to. There's a mechanic. There's a lot of cards that do something immediately just upon you putting a land from your hand into play. They'll trigger.
Normally once a turn.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I should say that. You're only allowed to play one land per turn, normally. But, all of a sudden, those kinds of effects, if you're now, every time you play a creature, it is treated as a land coming into play for the purposes of those triggered effects. So now, there's no limit on how many times you can play creatures. It's just as many as you can afford. But also, all of my creatures can produce additional mana. So here we find ourselves in this situation where now I'm starting to tap creatures that have just come into play to play more creatures, to trigger all these land value synergies, and it just starts going. And then, like, what's really horrifying is then if you can find a way to, like, draw cards off of either creatures or lands entering the battlefield. Because normally, the whole thing about having a ton of mana is you play your hand out, you only draw one card per turn under normal circumstances, and so now you got an empty hand, you've got all this mana, nothing to spend it on. But if you can draw even a steady, you know, just a couple extra cards per turn, or God forbid, one every time you play a creature or a land, now all of a sudden you have this value engine that just runs on its own, and all you have to do is just keep playing cards, and they just keep producing more cards for you to play and the means for you to play them. And so it's just this treadmill now. And so I don't know.
That seems like a ton of fun. Yeah, sounds like how does that character, what's the text on it? Because he's not hard to get up and running. Is it like a turn 4 and 5 thing?
It's horrifyingly easy if you know what you're doing, which is what I would say. That's what I would say. The card itself costs 5 mana. So again, if you're playing only one land per turn, it normally would take you 5 turns before you would be able to play this card out of your hand. But of course, you can't settle with that, right? That's the prescribed way of bringing this card out. So the deck is designed in such a way where the early stages of the game focus very heavily on getting as much, like, trying to jump ahead and basically cut ahead in line, right? So try to get 1 or 2 mana up on the normal turn you'd be at. So my goal is to have, ideally, like 5 mana available to me on turn 3. That's my goal. And so I've now, right, I'm up 2 turns on anyone else who's just playing one land and only playing cards at that rate. And then what this card specifically says is it says non-token creatures. Tokens are a special kind of card that you don't put in your deck, but they're created by other cards. So non-token creatures that started play in my deck, are considered forest lands in addition to their other types. So forests are one of the 5 kinds of lands, and they produce green mana. The deck is completely green, so it only needs the one kind. And so what it means is, as long as this card is in play, as a static effect, it means that all of the creatures I control, yes, are considered lands, and they're considered creatures, and it is no penalty to them.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so it has some really interesting, there's all these specific and interesting consequences of cards that interrelate in really horrifying ways to get a lot of value. But if you can get it out into play relatively quickly, it can begin to accelerate at an exponential rate almost immediately. Like, you really just need to, like, if you can play this thing on turn 3 as early as turn 4, because here's the thing, it also counts itself. So it is also a forest. So if you have... Yeah, so if you now, like, if you've managed to play a couple of creatures, any creatures, in the intervening turns before you put it into play, you could easily double the amount of mana that's available to you just by playing this one card. And so on your subsequent turns, like, I'm saying, I'm trying to have 5 mana available on turn 3. That's 2 more than the average person. All of a sudden, I could have as much as, like, 8 mana on turn 4, and now I'm double what anyone else is going to have at the table. And so, that starts to have all these interesting consequences. And one of the big ones that I really like, one of the funniest things you can do that I like, is any card that is defensive in nature. Like, this card, because it's so essential to the strategy of the whole deck, like, most of the synergies in the deck turn off if this card isn't in play. I need to spend, like, a big portion of the deck, a nice little portion of the deck, is just cards designed to keep this card in play and protect it against any kind of assault or anyone who's trying to remove it. And so one of the things that's funny about this is that normally, if you have a card that is this essential to your strategy that isn't a land, if you want to have access to protective spells to protect that asset, you have to keep a certain amount of your lands untapped and available to still produce the mana you need to cast that spell. That is not true in this case. As long as I have an untapped creature, which could be the creature that I'm going to target with the spell, I have access to a certain amount of mana. And so this card can regularly protect itself from being destroyed by tapping itself and producing its own mana to cast a spell targeting it.
That's amazing.
So it just, yeah, there's some really exciting consequences to that. The other thing is its size, its statistics, scale off of the number of lands you have in play, which of course also means that all of my non-token creatures count to its size. So normally the going rate for the two stats, power and toughness, toughness is much less valuable, but power is usually costed to match up with the mana cost of the card, of the creature. And so like a creature with 4 power is gonna usually cost you around 4 mana. If it has like very low toughness, you might get a little bit of a discount because it's such a specific shape. But if something's got like even power and toughness, odds are that's the amount of mana that it's going to cost. This card easily can come into play as a 6/6 or greater, 6 power and 6 toughness, which means that I'm already up 1 on the mana that I spent to play it. But you also have to take into account that I'm also probably up a couple of turns on anyone else who would have the budget to play a creature of that power. So normally, say if I'm playing this creature on turn 3, and most people are only going to have access to creatures with with power and toughness 3/3 in that general range on turn 3, I could easily put out a 6/6 on turn 3. And now all of a sudden, again, I'm not only have I got way more mana than everyone else, I have a creature that's twice the size of anything else they have in play.
So, are you, like, swinging with this? Also, is this your commander?
Oh, yes. So I should say yes. This is my commander. The entire deck, like, I found this out that this card existed, and I literally, like, I went to the Pacific Northwest before New Year's, and I literally went to, like, I looked at card shops here in California. I looked at card shops in Oregon. I had to go all the way to Washington to get this card because when I saw it, it just, there's no other words for it than love at first sight. I
didn't know that this was the journey. This is what you were up there for.
It's not why I went. It was a happy consequence. It was a happy consequence of that.
It's a more fun story if you say you were up there to get this card.
That's how I feel. I literally think, like, if someone were to offer me, like, there's like promo versions of this card with like fancier art and like more exclusive designs and things, I wouldn't take them. This is mine. I went to 3 states to get this specific card, and it was the last one they had in stock. Like,
oh my god,
like, it was everything. So this card has a story to it, but also it's worth saying, I have spent, like, throughout my career with Magic, this whole relationship with lands and like trying to find ways to use lands that no one else is thinking about. That is something that I've worked through in stages with different commanders that have different strategies and different approaches. And all of them have been exciting in their way. No disrespect. Shout out to Mina and Den and the Gitrog monster. Great commanders in their own right who've all taught me, I learned specific lessons from each one of them. I couldn't be where I am today without them. But this specific card it took this specific, it's like you have this specific field of research, like you're part of an academic community and there's a specific discipline within that you have chosen to invest yourself in, and it's a fairly niche one, and all of a sudden you sort of have a breakthrough where, like, all of the work you've done that you weren't sure where it was going or what it was pointing you towards, all of a sudden there's like divine inspiration, right? Something happens and it all starts to fit together and it all starts to make sense,
Cold fusion breakthrough.
Kind of, yeah. And so that's kind of what this card has been for me, because there's just these little cards that I've had for ages that have been these like pet cards that I keep putting in decks and being like, someday, man, this will be the card. You'll see this card that everyone else looks at and is like, I couldn't care less about that. That's like so underpowered and so niche, so specific in its use case that I don't even want to think about it. I've been carrying these cards with me and probably been dragged down by them many times. But all of a sudden, there's these new amazing opportunities. There's this great card. I'll try to avoid referring to too many specific cards, but there's one card.
Are fascinating. I want to know.
All right, well, fuck it. I mean, this is our podcast. I guess we get to talk about whatever we want.
Pretty much.
But yeah, there's this one specific card, and it has the effect that it's a creature. It's very small. It's only a 1/1, so it's like it is never meant to fight anything. It just exists for this effect. But you can tap it to untap a land. And the main idea of that is that there's other cards that have this effect, and they allow you to produce, you produce more mana by doing that, right? Yeah. But this specific card, right? There's two interesting things. So this specific card, it can tap itself to untap a land, and it has an additional clause on it that whenever a land enters the battlefield, it untaps. So normally, that's only once per turn, right? And so it can tap itself, give you a little more mana, then it untaps, then it taps again, untaps another land. So you've got 2 more mana available in a turn off this one card.
Yeah.
But there's 2 things that are important here, both of which stem from the fact that all of my creatures are lands. So one is that I can use this creature to untap any one of my creatures at my discretion if I want to. So if I attack with a creature and it's tapped out, and then I want to defend myself with that same creature, I can tap this creature and untap the creature I want to block with. So there's value to that. The other thing, though, is really that when a land enters the battlefield under your control clause, that is where things really happen, because this creature, as long as my commander is in play, is considered a forest. So it doesn't have to go through the additional step of untapping other lands. It can just tap itself to make green mana. It can do that all by itself. And any creature that I play with that mana will untap this creature, which essentially means that any creature I have that I'm going to cast while this card is in play has a 1 mana discount applied to it, because they will always untap it. This extends to creatures that only cost 1 mana, which I can now play for free out of my hand. And if just playing that creature is triggering synergies from lands and or creatures entering the battlefield, like drawing cards, for instance, now I can be drawing cards for free just by playing creatures out of my hand, and I'm building up a board state. I've got blockers. Most of these cheap creatures also tap for mana, so I'm just generating more value all the time. Yeah. So should I keep gushing, or?
Green Town.
Well, so the only other thing, huh?
What was the card name?
Oh, this card, it is named Stone Cedar Hierophant.
Oh no, but what's the commander card name?
Oh, Ashaya, Soul of the Wild. But yeah, so just the interrelation of these 2 cards is particularly special to me, because Stone Cedar Hierophant is a card that I've been carrying with me for ages, putting it in decks that it didn't perform in, just to try to find that secret sauce. But where it gets really exciting is that, oh my god, I know, that's how deep the tech with this deck goes. It's so ridiculous. But all I'll say, this is pretty much the end, but I'll just say there are one of the kinds of cards that can interact with your lands is there are enchantment effects that you can play onto your lands that make it so that they can tap for larger amounts of mana. And so this, of course, because all of my creatures are lands, I can now play those enchantments directly onto my creatures. And what's interesting about that, the reason that that's so hilarious, right, is if you imagine I'm in this situation where I have this creature that is untapping itself to play 1-drop cards for free. If I increase the amount of mana that card produces, my budget for free creatures goes up. And so I can easily, within the deck, I can get it to the point where this thing allows me to play an infinite number of creatures that cost 3 mana or less. As many as I have in my hand. I can just put them all directly into play and still have this creature be untapped at the end, ready to spend 3 mana on something else.
So cool.
So, but this is like, I have spent literally years of my life working up to the point where I can articulate these combos. But that is, I think that experience is the best of Magic. Like, that is the best you can get out of Magic, is like, because they are these game assets designed by another person, you never fully have, like, your stamp on, like, that's my card. I designed that. I came up with that.
Right.
But the part of the beauty of any kind of system where, like, you have something that can be reinterpreted by the audience and you put it out there, like, you as one person or as a small team of creative people can never see all the potential permutations that your creative endeavor can, like, go through. But as it's iterated across, like, hundreds and thousands of people, all trying to bring their own unique spin in, you can start to bring new things into being that, although they use, like, pre-existing assets, they were never intended by the original designers. They were never conceptualized in that form by the people who originally made them.
It does, I think it kind of speaks to how it's a microcosm of a lot of, I guess I want to say, like, art and sort of meaning making, not to get wildly philosophical.
Let's do it, man. Let's be honest to who we are in the conversations that we have, right? Like,
it's happening. That I'm hopefully not going to drag us back to how living in the modern world is terrifying and sad. That like meaning making is this process of, or you're always walking this fine line between doing something new, but not just doing, like, nonsense bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's a critique of, or the common critique of, you know, abstract art is that, like, well, this just looks like what a child would be scribbling, and it's like, well, you know, you're not engaging with it, you're not thinking about it, or maybe it is, like, not a very good piece.
Mm-hmm.
And walking that line, and I guess a space like, I mean, music is sort of a good example where you have these, like, structures and rhythms and patterns that it stops being a song if you're not at least sort of rhythmic or sort of have a tune. So there's these rules that you play in, and I think Magic is, like, it's got a lot of rules, it's got a lot of structure. Like, you have to play a real card, you can't just make up a card. But at the same time, you can, like, come up with a couple card effects and then look through the catalog and probably find something close and be like, well, actually, like, yeah, this, you know, there's shit out there. And I think that's sort of the wonder in, not only is there uh, a strictly like a set of rules that makes sense and is consistent, but it's also like a big enough space that like the process of exploration actually sort of means something,
Mm-hmm.
and you can be in it for years without knowing about a card that has a huge amount of synergy with
Yeah.
your specific kind of genre of play.
Yeah.
So that's it's an exciting space.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly that feeling I think is one of the coolest things about Magic is that like especially when you're new, it just feels like there's an infinite number of cards. Like you know that that can't literally be true, but it's just like it's so there's just so many. There's so many cards and like design philosophy within Wizards of the Coast has changed over time. What is considered powerful has changed over time. So like there is always this like I say, they have this amazing card database, but it's interesting because it's like if you don't know what you're looking for, you can still be surprised. Like you can if you can go looking for what you expect, but like one of the greatest joys in Magic the Gathering is sitting down across from another person and they play a card out of their hand and you go, "Wait, what the fuck is that? I don't know what that is. I've never seen that before. Damn, I got to get me some of that." Like that
That's
is
cool.
peak Magic the Gathering. Like that is the joy of it is like and then having those conversations with your friends where you like theory craft and really get into like man if you got this card and this card and this card into play, oh my god, they interact in this like two cards have some crazy thing, but when you add a third card, now you're in some kind of fourth dimensional space where the rules of the game are warping and like and that's the joy and like that in and of itself that can be the genesis of a deck or a whole new strategy and even an archetype in the game where like you find a way like oh well none of these cards are like none of these cards are legendary creatures so they can't be my commander so they all have to be in a deck. So the question is like how am I going to like organize a situation, architect my deck such that I can make sure that all of these game pieces come out into play in a specific way and create the effect that I want. And just like it's often said about Magic that the real Magic is the gathering. And there's truth in that where it's about like coming together with people and having these weird discussions about like I'm sure you can empathize with this about like when you go into a situation where someone really knows their stuff about like swing dancing or like Lindy Hop in particular and
Yeah,
like
yeah,
you can use terminology to describe things in a way that you just can't say certain things to a layman because it like the amount of explanation that goes into that almost isn't worth it so you just abbreviate. But when you actually are in that moment where you have those people that you can just like explain, like you saying exactly what you mean instead of trying to
yeah.
translate between your sincere thoughts and like the audience you're speaking to, that's like that's when you're really living in the moment, man. When you're just like totally connected like your mind to someone else's mind and you're using these
Yeah.
mouth sounds that we've decided mean certain feelings and ideas to like really interface with another person.
So when you were talking, actually, the space that I feel like, especially the sort of the theory crafting and that like sense of exploration and playing within a set of rules while still like having a lot of space to kind of learn and grow in it. I found myself thinking about my sort of relationship to work and engineering and like writing code as a space that I've recently come to sort of lament, and it's a shame that I feel like I don't meet a lot of people who are like into it for just like the love of doing it, and I
Mm-hmm.
kind of understand why when it's work. Um, but there is that like being very invested in specific kind of questions or topics, and you're sort of talking about this field of research that you're like really dedicated to, and I have that with a specific kind of question that I'm pretty deep in the rabbit hole on, and it's like there are other people who are smart, and a lot of them are people that I've learned stuff from on YouTube. But when I go to sort of like talk about it with real human beings, it's like no one's super fascinated by React state management. But then talking to even talking to people who do, it's interesting. Kind of like you also get this understanding of the landscape when you take knowledge that I like the knowledge that I have and start to put it into context of other people, and which of these ideas are ideas that like are new, which of these are ideas that are like kind of old and actually they're like bad ideas that I just haven't realized because I didn't talk to anyone about it, and yeah, which of them are like, oh wait, that's super smart, and I sort of took my own stuff for granted until I started like talking to people about it. Like, oh wait, this is like really cool. My own little land deck.
That's cool, man. That's great. Like when you have that thing where it's like you can talk to a lot of other people about programming. You have a basic cursory understanding. I can talk to anybody about Magic who plays Magic. Right. But then, yeah, you have that thing where it is interesting, like, actually, it's very interesting what you say there, where, like, you take for granted that your own ideas aren't novel, almost, as if, like, because I'm working within a framework, anything I have thought of has clearly been thought of by someone else before me. But then when you do actually start to talk to those people, like, certainly you learn a lot of novel things from them, but also you realize, like, just how much, like, actually I have come up with something that maybe someone else hasn't thought about, or am bringing a new perspective. Because, like, you are always ultimately bringing a unique perspective, right? How original that unique perspective is that's up to context. But it is interesting where it's like you get a lot of perspective on like what it is that you actually bring to the table by talking to other people and seeing what it is that they bring and don't bring, right? Oh, hello.
Hi.
Hi.
I don't know what it is. We'll cut it, and it'll be fine.
Yeah. Yeah, this will be a nice little project. I'll probably try to edit this some tomorrow or something. That could be a good thing to work on. Well, listen, Connor, we've actually been at this for over 2 hours now, believe it or not.
I checked my phone and I was like, damn.
Yeah, when did that happen? But I think this was a great first go around.
I feel like we got 2 whole podcasts here.
Probably. We'll have to edit out some bits, but I think I think we got some good stuff here. In particular, it's a prototype, so I think it would be good. I would like to try to post this. Just edit some shit, and post it just as like an exercise.
That would be so cool.
Or here, let's sign off, and then we can have a little bit of a powwow off camera. How does that sound?
That's smart.
So, you folks out there, listeners who are not yet listening but will someday, this has been tentatively named Off the Tracks. We'll see.
That's what's growing on me.
Yeah, I think it describes the vibe. It's kind of, we're definitely just kind of moving from idea to idea. But so Connor, do you want to plug anything?
You could go look at betterbookkeeping.com if you want.
All right, folks, you heard him. Betterbookkeeping.com. Well, as I said at the top of the show, I am the Muscle Dad, and you can find me as the Muscle Dad on Twitch and on YouTube. honestly, shooting this podcast is kind of catalyzing me to try to like stream again. God damn it.
All set up right there.
Yeah, it is. That's a lot of what I'm saying. Is like when I sit in front of this thing, I'm like, oh yeah, this is comfortable. I remember being here. But yeah, thanks, folks. You know, we appreciate you, Connor. Appreciate you.
Appreciate you, Roy.
Hey, thanks, buddy.
You're my land.
Yeah. Hey, you too.